Welcome to the Cyber Sangha podcast. Cyber Sangha is a program of free live broadcasts, launched in 2009 by renowned teacher and author Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. Join us as we draw on ancient Tibetan wisdom to discover how to connect with our best self and live to our highest potential. The following conversation, the Mind-Brain Debate, Why Do We Have a Brain Anyway?, happened on July 14th, 2021 as a science and spirituality dialogue with James Duffy, Charles Raison, and host Alejandro Chaoul-Reich. This was part of a year-long series, A Year of Body, Speech, and Mind. This content is for informational purposes only. Listeners should consult medical professionals for any physical or mental health concerns. Please use headphones and do not meditate while driving or operating machinery.
Hello and welcome to another of our dialogues of body, breath, and mind. And today we'll focus on the mind in this brain-mind dialogue debate. And this title of Why Do We Have a Brain Anyways? And I'm here with my friends and colleagues, Doctors Chuck Raison and Jim Duffy. And I'll talk a little bit more about them. But before I do that, I wanted to say, usually we have Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who started Cyber Sangha. Today he's traveling and he couldn't join us, but he'll continue to join us in further dialogues. And as some of you know, we've done dialogues with body, breath, and mind, following not only a dialogue, but every month we have a 24-hour practice that goes all around the world. We kind of pass the baton, and they're always open. So you're always welcome to join. It's a wonderful way to feel in Sangha, in this idea of Cyber Sangha, that wherever we are, we can be connected. And besides that, of course, Rinpoche provides a practice for that month, and then we have these kinds of dialogues. I've been a student of Rinpoche for 30 years almost, and direct the aspect of research at McMincha Institute, and I'm also at the Mind, Body, Spirit Institute at the Jung Center here in Houston. And today we have with us Dr. Charles Raison, who's in Wisconsin, and he's the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Distinguished Chair of the Healthy Minds, Children, and Families, and professor at the School of Human Ecology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a professor there at the Department of Psychiatry in the School of Medicine and Public Health. And he serves as the Director of Clinical and Translational Research at the Usona Institute. He's a Director of Research on Spiritual Health and Emory Healthcare. Did you hear that? Spiritual Health for Emory Healthcare. And a visiting professor for the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University in Atlanta. So he gets to travel. Maybe more than he wants. His research focuses on examining novel mechanisms involved in the development and treatment of major depression and other stress-related emotional and physical conditions, as well as the physical and behavioral effects of compassion training, something that I want to touch upon today. More recently, Dr. Raison has taken leadership role in the development of psychedelic medicines, also very interesting topic for today, as potential treatments for major depression. So then we have also Dr. Duffy, who actually, what's really nice today is that they both know each other well, and this may come up in the dialogue. And Jim is an emeritus professor of psychiatry at UCSF, Weill Institute for Neurosciences at the University of California, San Francisco. He's an elected fellow of the American Neuropsychiatry Association and the Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. He's a board certified in psychiatry, integrative medicine, psychosomatic medicine, and medical acupuncture. And his current clinical focus is on developing practical approaches to an integrative psychiatry that incorporates both the wisdom of ancient traditions and the knowledge garnered from the modern medical scientific approach. And I've had the pleasure and honor to work with Jim for many years while we were together at the Institute of Religion and Health that we transformed into the Spirituality and Health. And that aspect of spirituality, again, is something that to all three of us is something very important, and it will come up as we dialogue between mind and brain. So I usually like to start these dialogues, but something personal, kind of what brought you into this field? What's your interest in this besides the professional aspects that we can talk as well? So Chuck, since I see that you're highlighted, so let's go for you first.
Huh. Well, it's ironic. We're talking about mind. I got interested. I came into this field sort of through an interest in the body, but also, very appropriate for the institute that we're kind of with today. I was a clinical professor at UCLA back in the 90s. I just worked full time, ran a psychiatric emergency room. I just saw patients. I had a dream of being a researcher, but I think it was rough. I couldn't figure out how to do it. But I got really interested in Buddhism, like a lot of people do. I'd kind of hit early midlife, and it struck out in several romantic relationships. And I came to one of those moments where I just was like, something is dissatisfying here, right? And so, that's of course the beginning of one's interest in things like Buddhism. And so I started going to a Buddhist center down in Southern California, and through a weird series of accidents, I got hit up to host a giant fundraising dinner at UCLA. For the Dalai Lama's sister, Jetsun Pema, who in those years was the head of the Tibetan Children's Village. So I put together this crazy fundraising dinner, got to know the Dalai Lama's sister, who in turn said, there's a Tibetan Buddhist monk hanging around UCLA named Lobsang Rinpoche. You really should meet this guy. And so that was my entree into this sort of long connection I've had with Tibetan Buddhist, connections, affiliations. And so I brought Lobsang onto the consult service at UCLA, and every Monday night we would go out to Panda Inn, which was sort of the godfather of Panda Express, and he would just talk to me about Tibetan Buddhist stuff and, just the Tibetan Buddhist world for a few hours. And it was this education, but he one night started telling me about this wild thing called Tumo. And I'd never heard of this Tumo, and Jim can tell you a lot more about it. You guys know a lot more about it than I do. But, it's this very interesting meditative technique that uses, these sort of bodily breath practices to modulate thermoregulation, to change people's body temperature, and it allows people to withstand incredible degrees of cold. So I got fascinated by a very, very simple question, which is, why would people commit years to learning how to raise their body temperature to achieve enlightenment? I mean, I can understand raising your body temperature because you're cold. I can understand doing things for enlightenment. And Rinpoche said something to me that it kind of became the basis for a lot of my career, which is, he said, when you think about sutra practices, the challenge and why it takes so long to achieve Buddhahood is just that the mind's so flighty. Your mind's popping all over the place. What these tantric practices like Tummo do is they put the mind in these very stable kind of mental states that allow you to sort of withstand a quick view of emptiness. It was that idea that the body could sort of be a deep brain stimulator. I later came to see that really it obsessively fascinated me, and I literally became a researcher because I was in those years hell bent on trying to understand from a Western perspective, from a reductionist, sort of biological perspective, what was Tummo doing to thermoregulatory signaling pathways that would induce really, really powerful positive mental states. Because I thought, if we understand that, we could understand perhaps not just sort of the biology of those states, but also how to engender them. So it really, I've had this sort of crazy career where I've done a little of this and a little of that, but it started with Tummo, and it started with this Tibetan Buddhist perspective on how brain-body kind of processes could be tapped into to produce these elevated mental states.
Wonderful. Thank you. I actually didn't know the connection with Dr. Lobsang Rinpoche, so we'll talk more about that.
It's a small world in our world, isn't it?
It is. Jim, what was your interest in how did you come into this field?
Well, so when traditional academics look at my CV, the typical reaction is, "Oh dear, you seem to have been lost." Why do you keep changing direction? Others, however, say, "Oh, this makes sense." And so I like to make sense of my journey to this point by simply being a question. How can I benefit others? So through each stage of my training. You know, I became a physician without much conscious awareness other than it was just who I was. I remember I was 15 years old and I was in a boarding school in the middle of Africa and sitting in the quad. And at that age in the English system, you actually have to decide at the age of 15, are you going to move into the sciences or into the arts? Sciences being engineering and medicine, and the arts being a journalist or a lawyer or a writer, something like that. And I so much loved the English literature and history and philosophy. And I remember being tearful saying, I have to give it up because I'm a physician. I don't have a choice. Which it wasn't that way, right? And so found myself in medical school, and those years were just about cramming knowledge into my small brain. And once I graduated, I was being confronted immediately. I remember my first day as an intern being confronted with terrible suffering in a unit of men who had end-stage esophageal cancer, who were dying of starvation and neglect, and saying, well, what can I do? And my response was to put up IV lines and give analgesia. And that felt it was helpful. But each way of the journey, just when I realized pretty quickly that putting up IV lines and giving morphine wasn't probably an answer to everybody's suffering. So, although sometimes I think people would like to do that. I kind of just went on this journey and ended up doing internal medicine. And then because I couldn't figure out how to help people who were suffering by training as an internist, I felt I was actually increasing suffering. I said, I'm out of here. I'm going to go become a radiologist. So I sat in front of an X-ray screen, and I was told that when I was asking patients about why they thought they were constipated, that wasn't the purpose of a barium enema. It was to get good pictures. And so it became pretty clear. So then I was reading Jung, and I it's really hard to imagine, right? In the 70s, I mean, certainly in Africa, there was no access to Eastern philosophy. I had a few books of Paul Brunton. I don't know if you remember Paul Brunton, but he was really the first guy that explored into Tibet. And then I almost joined the Hare Krishnas one day. It was a close call, but I really liked the Bhagavad Gita. But that was it. So I went into psychiatry, and psychiatry was wonderful, and I just loved the psychodynamic theory and family systems. But no one would tell me why that gentleman who was dragging his right arm and the leg and got depressed, could there be a connection? I was told, well, wouldn't you be depressed if you? And I said, well, yeah, but they don't get depressed if they drag their left leg. And so that's how I got into neuropsychiatry. And neuropsychiatry, and I just go through this, I think it's helpful to our conversation. So neuropsychiatry, I trained with what was considered to be the leader in the field, and it was remarkable. We had more questions than answers, but my mentor was spending his spare time studying the cytoarchitecture of a structure in the brain called the insular cortex. Now, this was around 1990, right? So not that long ago. And I said to him one day, I said, Dr. Meslin, why are you spending so much of your time studying a structure that doesn't seem to have a purpose, right? It's insular, it's like hanging out by itself, right? And he said, well, we don't know what it does now, but one day we will. And my architecture will help us to understand it better. So what I found in neuropsychiatry was a reductionist brain-based approach where we studied lesions and their causes and effects. And around the same time was really becoming more connected to Buddhist philosophy. I felt like coming home, and especially the Tibetan people. And so had this parallel life going on. And when I got my first faculty job at Brown, I announced that I was interested in studying consciousness. So I was told that that was the end of any academic aspirations I might have right there. So ended up studying frontal lobes. And, in the 1990s, you could fill a whole auditorium on the topic of the frontal lobes. It was terra incognita. Wow, what were these things, right? We talk about Phineas Gage, who lost his frontal lobe and acted inappropriately, but it wasn't much else. And so, boy, we come a long way. And then got into palliative medicine because people were suffering and dying, and nobody would even give them an analgesic because we didn't want, they said, oh, you're going to become a drug addict. I said, well, he's not going to last more than a week. So obviously ridiculous, right? And of course, as we come to our conversation about hallucinogens, I mean, America, as Winston Churchill said, has a tremendous capacity to take a good idea and make it bad, right? So here we are. I mean, here I was training end-of-life practice for physicians, and yet here we are 25 years later with a tremendous opiate problem. So just moving forward, I then got into integrative stuff, and everything is about how can I help people? Just when I think I've got an answer, oh, another problem, I can't do it. And got into Chinese medicine about 15, 20 years ago, and I've just enamored by it. It's just like coming home, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about Chinese medicine perspectives on brain and mind, and which were really challenging to me. I was really it took me years to find my feet again. But anyway, so here I am, and I've been left academic practice to work in the community as an integrative psychiatrist, using these different modalities. Hopefully have enough tools in my toolbox now that most people who turn up, I think I have a tool for that. But having said that, I'm always humble. Somebody can come up with something that I haven't got a clue. But anyway, so that's kind of who I am, and just looking forward to a great conversation. I'm sorry if I went on too long.
No, thank you. It's always, I find that it's always interesting for us to know each other, and for the audience to know who you are more than just what the title says and what your career, but really where your heart is, and where your consciousness is. We're going to get into that. Now, what strikes me, not surprises me, but strikes me is that you both mentioned often this word suffering, right? And this is really what brought you into this field. That really the aspect of suffering is what really brought you into this interest of how do we work with this. Now, also interesting is, even though, of course, because of where we are, even if you were in Africa, Jim, under kind of in a British Africa, and Chuck being here, you were under the kind of Western system of medicine. You both got interested in Eastern systems. So Chuck more with Lobsang and the Tibetan medicine, Jim with the Chinese medicine. And I think this is also where we talk about, is really brain the area where the mind is, or is it the heart? Is there consciousness? And where is consciousness? Where do we find it? So let me go back to Chuck, and if you can tell us some of the things that you learned from Lobsang, and maybe not just from Lobsang, but from that area of working with Tibetan medicine, and that might inform more as we continue in this dialogue.
Well, so I'm kind of a pretty straightforward Western guy, which is interesting. I mean, probably much more. Jim's got way deeper, cred in the world of understanding the Eastern worldviews. I'm this weird guy that frustrates everybody, because I'm a sort of, by day I'm a reductionist, by night I'm a secret, longer for spiritual truths. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people in the West like me. We just sort of. So it's interesting that I've had some interesting go-rounds with Tibetan medicine too. I've known a bunch of people at Mensikong and things like this. And they are such radically different systems that I spent less, at the end of the day, I spent less time trying to integrate those worldviews with sort of scientific worldviews, and more time. What I really took away from I think the tantric perspective, as I understood it, was that not so much so let me back up for a second. So in the work I do, I don't study, the subtle body. These sort of things that are not scientifically, science just doesn't have a way to get at it. What I took with me was this idea that the mind and the body are so much less separated from each other than we tend to think of, right? So one of my big beefs with psychiatry in the last 15, 20 years is this idea that mental illnesses are brain disorders, to which I say that is a load of BS, right? I'm not somebody, I mean, from a Western perspective, the brain is clearly the primary generator of our conscious experience. You can clip certain, areas of the brain and you bye conscious experience. But it's a category mistake to think that because that's true, that the brain is the source of our suffering, all of our suffering, or it's the source of mental illnesses, that in fact, what I've gone around saying for the last 5 or 6 years is that if you just look at it, at the way things are, you don't need to have any sort of mystical perspective to realize that if you take something like depression, it's very easy to show that the causes of depression, they can be in the brain. Yeah, Jim, you referred to, people have a stroke, so you can get people have a left frontal stroke. And those people very often, if you've never had a history of depression, they'll get depressed. And, I think it's credible to say in a case like that, yeah, they're depressed because their brain got broken, but one of the things we found with, after I tried to be a tumor researcher and abandoned it and became a psychoneuroimmunologist and studied how the immune system affected the brain, which grew out of sort of some of the implications of tumor from a Western perspective. One of the things we realized was that, you can make people feel really depressed just by injecting inflammation into their body. And if you inject inflammation into their body, if you activate these immune systems that get activated when you get really sick, that you can change the way the brain functions, and you can change it so that it looks exactly like the brain of a depressed person. And, people that are under inflammation will often tell you they're depressed. We studied people who got this medicine called interferon alpha, which basically made them massively inflamed in their body. And a bunch of them got depressed. And when you looked at their brain scans looked like somebody that was just, kind of regular old depressed. And this was this sort of shocking moment for me that I realized that, it may be that if you want to be really reductionist, it may be that those patterns of brain activity fully explain why the person is saying, I feel depressed. But those patterns of brain activity are not coming because the brain is broken. They're coming because the brain is getting a signal from the body. And the signal from the body, if you ask, what is the evolutionary signal from the body of inflammation? It's you're sick and you're going to die. And people tend to get depressed when they feel like their chances of survival and reproduction are threatened, right? So the brain pattern looks exactly like a depressed brain pattern, but in this case, it's a perfectly, as bad as depression is, it's perfectly appropriate. The brain's not broken, it's responding to those circumstances, right? And then from there, we begin to realize that, the causes of a mental state, let's say depression, extend past the body, right? So there's a fascinating study that was an add-on to this giant depression study called STAR-D that looked at mothers who had kids under the age of 17 who were really depressed. And in this study, they gave everybody an antidepressant, an SSRI. And they asked a really cool question. They said, if we give the mother this antidepressant and she does or does not respond, will that impact the mental health of her children? So they measured the depression and anxiety of the kids. And what they found was quite striking, that if a mother takes a medicine and her depression goes into remission, the kid's depression, in fact, gets even less, it gets better than the mom's depression. The kid doesn't take the pill, but he or she has this massive change of brain state because the mother took this little organic substance, right? And, I don't think there's magic molecules floating between the mom and the kid. I think what it is that, we're such social creatures that we're exquisitely tuned to receive information from other people. So here, the mom takes a chemical, the chemical changes the mom's brain, but that has a bigger effect on the mental state of the kid in the kid's depression. And if you think about this, and you can go out, if you ask, hey, I'm from Mars and I got $1 trillion and I want to do something for depression in the world. One of the things you could do is just, get rid of air pollution. There's a massive association between things like air pollution and depression and suicide, right? So out you go. And, I've argued that all these things are very, very powerful causes of mental states, because you change the cause, you change the outcome, right? And what else do we mean by a cause? So if that's true, you can either, be really reductionistic and boring and say, well, that means that, these external things, influence the brain, which is where the consciousness is. Or you can be a little bit more daring and you can say, well, another way to think about that is that human consciousness is a little bit like a quantum phenomenon, that, yeah, it's maybe mostly in your head, it's a bit more in your body, but that each of our consciousness in a non-trivial way sort of blurs out into this larger world. And the reason it's non-trivial is because I can affect my conscious states by those, further out areas. So that really, this is sort of an argument that consciousness is dispersed beyond the brain, basically, while not necessarily saying, well, the brain, doesn't have anything to do with consciousness. So anyway, like Jim, sorry, long answer. But
no, but that was fascinating. And of course, we all we're preaching to the choir here in terms of the mind-body connection. But in terms of the study that you mentioned, I think there might be two things. One is what you just mentioned about the relationship between mother and child and children. The other part is, it's not just changing her brain, but it's also changing her behavior, right?
Yes.
And by changing her behavior with the children, that also may help that modification.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what it is. That's exactly what it is, right? It's the information transfer from her changed behavior, from the way her face looks, to the way she reacts to things, right? Absolutely. That's that's exactly right.
Great. Jim, do you want to say something on that and maybe bring some of the Chinese medicine aspect that you've been?
So I just wanted to just acknowledge the contribution that Chuck has made to the care of people with mental illness by his willingness to bring in variables to the methodology that other people aren't brave enough or open enough to even consider. I mean, anyway, so I think just to pick up on what Chuck was talking about, I just to go back to the fundamental question, which is, why people are interested in Buddhism, why they're interested in religion, why they're interested in suffering. Why science was really a response to suffering. The Enlightenment was generated by this belief that science could relieve suffering, and we could separate ourselves from nature. We could put nature on the rack and hold it subjugate to our will, right? Francis Bacon, so to paraphrase him. So just to go back a couple of steps, I think this is important. This conversation could fill in an encyclopedia, but I think to go back to basic question, what is suffering, right? So you know better than I do, Al, the nature of the different kinds of suffering that are described. When I first got, I used to be a palliative care doc. They used to say, "Oh, here comes Jim bringing all the suffering with him." I used to say, "I didn't bring the suffering. I just happened to be addressing it." But the fact was that just by making it real, people were uncomfortable. So suffering. So people say, "What is suffering?" And I go to Harrison's textbook. There's not even in the book. There's nothing in the directory, but nothing. So I came up with this comment: that suffering comes from the experience of being alone. And I said, "Why the hell did I just say that?" But it's stuck, and I keep finding it. The more I look at that, the more it makes sense. To go back to what Chuck tried to connect the threads here. So suffering comes from the experience of being alone, and I do agree with Martin Buber that to be human, in brackets sentient, is to be relational. Then suffering comes from a breakdown in the nature of our relations to other, all right? Whether it be in the sentient field, cognitive field. I've seen many people who, for example, might have autism who are not suffering because they actually are really well connected to their cognitive world. People are doing this right now on the internet, right? So suffering is a relational thing, right? And relationships are shaped by our priorities, our motivations, our perspectives, right? So where does that lead me? Well, so then suffering is all about understanding through what lens we are experiencing ourselves and our relationship to the world, right? And therefore, suffering can really only be addressed through a quantum perspective, and that Western medicine is based on Newtonian mechanics, which abhors anything more than two variables in an experimental design. And so the thing about it, as Alan Wallace is always talking about, is that the Western world has made a terrible mistake. We've equated the scientific method with the philosophy of scientism or scientific materialism, right? And so we actually are living in a world of scientific materialism. We just don't even realize it. And so in that world, the brain can only be managed through the concept that everything is contained within the skull. And if it's non-local, then, or qualitative, then it's not real. And of course, psychiatry has been, the qualitative aspect has been psychiatry's bugbear, because we've always lived in the world of first-person experience or interpersonal experience. That's what's, that's why we had, like these retreats. There were moral treatment centers. People dealt with these things, but now we got the scientific method, and so we apply it like a razor to different questions, and we reduce it. And yeah, as Chuck said, everything is a microcosm, right? It's a fractal of everything else. And so, like I learned in Chinese medicine, if I had a needle small enough, I could treat anything with one cell, right? Because it's all a holograph, holons within holarchies, right? So to go back to what Chuck was talking about, so Western medicine has said, well, we're going to apply the scientific method, and we're going to become scientific materialists, that everything is physical, quantifiable, reproducible, there's only one way of doing it, and that's our reality, because that's what the scientific method. Now, if we come up with better technologies, right, when Chuck discovers a microscope that can see into quantum fields, that's kind of what you're doing with the mother and the child, right? You're spreading out the field of relationship. And you're still allowed to do that because, it's still one body, so. But anyway, so this brings us into that number one challenge for me for many years was, why the hell do people keep talking about the mind and the brain in the same sentence? We need to be very clear. What's the brain? What's the stuff of brain? What's shaped by the brain? What perspective does the brain generate? What telescope, like the flashlight, like that Tsongkhapa talked about. What is the brain? What are the limitations? It's fine. It's real. I mean, if I'm sitting in a room and it's full of snakes, but where I'm placing my flashlight is just full of emptiness, then I'm not going to see all the snakes, right? It doesn't mean that space is not real. It just means that it's probably going to have snakes. And I should be careful. So anyway, so the mind, the brain. What's the brain? So I personally, I don't have any. The issue for me is, how do we use language so that you know what you mean and I know what I mean, and we're not talking at cross purposes, because people are using these things interchangeably. And so the wonderful, wonderful thing is, our neuroscience has engaged in the first person experience through contemplative neuroscience. And people are actually, the hardcore neuroscientists, such as the person we were mentioning recently, they actually are forced now, because they have to actually at least admit that is one aspect of scientific reality, but that doesn't mean they incorporate it. So I didn't really, but I just want to say that everything everybody's saying is right. As Ken Wilber's always saying, nobody's smart enough to be wrong about everything. Right? So everybody's right. But in our world, there has to be one right answer, but there aren't. There is a gazillion sentient answers to every question, right? My dog has a different answer to whether it's too hot or too cold in this room right now. It doesn't mean that mine's valid and his not. So anyway, that's just some background thoughts on that. And I think for Chuck, how applying the scientific method without getting trapped in scientific materialism, right? Would you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it, of course, and it implies something else, which I often am telling people, which is, science is successful. First off, Jim, you are so right. That's a beautiful thing to say about the Enlightenment, right? Because, the Enlightenment's been in for a lot of crap lately, right? It's kind of got a bad rep, and, it certainly had its, like all human things. But, suffering, I'd love to go on to the suffering thing. Because you're right. This suffering is it's the basis of the world we live in, and it is what we try to alleviate as doctors. And we try, sometimes when we try to alleviate, we create more of it, right? It's like whack-a-mole. It's just, so anyway, I really appreciate that. But, science is it's a modest enterprise, right? I mean, it's successful because it doesn't make claims that, can't be tested in the public marketplace, and it can't be, science can help you turn on the lights. It doesn't raise the dead. And so one of the things I think that people do is that they ask too much of science also, right? I mean, but on the other hand, what's kind of beautiful about science, when I'm feeling kind of warm fuzzy about it, is that it does, in theory, offer groups of people that have very different sort of opinions to come to some sort of agreement, right? I mean, in theory, if you can conduct an experiment any place in the world and show the same result, then no matter where people started in terms of what their passionate, hypotheses were, you kind of get this agreement. Now, it's complicated because, of course, science is so overlaid with cultural stuff that this is the scientific paradigm jumping thing of what's his face. I mean, it's not, but it is as a human activity, it does have that great attractiveness to it, that it does sort of allow people to find common languages, at least for certain periods until there's a paradigm jump. But you're right that what it creates in terms of a worldview, when taken as a sort of kind of scientific materialist reductionist, is very, very hard. And it's very hard for the human heart. I have been enjoying and suffering through a rather intense cartoon series called Rick and Morty. And if you haven't watched it, it's all about the distress that a purely scientific worldview creates for human beings. The main character is this kind of alcoholic old dude who's the smartest guy in all the multiverse, and he's used science essentially to become a god. But the dude can't. He's just miserable because his worldview is so strangulating for him. So, this is a major issue that we face right now in our world. Humans, we live and die by our metaphors, and the metaphor of the mind as a machine and the body as a machine and all this stuff. We start acting like that. We start seeing ourselves that way, and it produces the human heart. It's just not what the human heart needs. So yeah, it's a real.
So I would argue that the real seduction of the scientific method and scientific materialism is that it creates the illusion of being in control.
Yeah.
And of course, we keep running up against the wall, and
Yep.
life keeps telling us that we're not actually in control. We're just participating in a grand mystery. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question though, Deb. Don't lose that thought. But I mean, you're kind of my age. I mean, we're old guys. Do you ever get nostalgic though for like the '60s? I mean, you came from a different place, but in America, really, I grew up in a world where I thought I'd be, kind of living on Mars, and that we really did have this sense of control. It was the Star Trek world. It was good. It was going to get better. That the frightening parts of suffering were going to be overcome, that we were going to live in a, sort of an Epcot, Disneyland, world. I get nostalgic for it. I have to admit it, because it really, I can see why we all bought it, man. It was really comforting. And, we were.
Well, I would actually argue that, in fact, there were two competing motivations going on. As you said, the one was of the empowering of the Enlightenment ideal that technology would actually set us free from the constraints of being physical beings. But the 60s that I was really drawn to, and I was so frustrated that I couldn't, living in Africa, all I could see was images from Woodstock and stuff. I probably wouldn't have survived living through the 60s in Berkeley, but for me, it was about actually the human potential movement. That it was more beyond what was our potential to control the physical world, but with Mike Murphy and others and the Esalen and Mazza was like, there are no limits to our capacity to be happy. Yeah. We just have to change our frame of reference, right?
Yeah.
So there were two competing, and unfortunately, I think the first won out, that we doubled down on the scientific method and we said, this is where we're going to put all our stakes. And guess what? We all know the outcome. So I think I want to go back to the question because I want to hear Chuck's thoughts about this, which was that Alejandro raised at the beginning. Why do we have a brain anyway? And so we've kind of agreed that we have a reduction, that we've tended to be reductionistic in Western science, neuroscience, psychiatry, about localizing the brain as the seat of everything. But, you come across these studies that just kind of, you say, what the hell does this mean? And so I came across a finding that just kind of blew my socks off, which was the sea squirt. Now, the sea squirt is it's like a tube, right? It has a tunic of fibrous structures. And it's, well, I believe I'm right in saying it's probably the earliest form of nervous system that we're aware of. And what blew my mind was that this little being will travel when it's kind of like looking for relocation opportunities, travels through the water, and at some point decides, this is the spot that I'm going to set up house. I'm going to take a 30-year mortgage out on this spot. And he then, or she, whatever, proceeds to eat their primitive spinal cord, which made it possible for them to move. In essence, then they're actually eating their own brains. So I look at that study and I say, so the earliest brains developed to allow us to move to places in the space-time continuum that are supportive of us and our perspective of what we need. And then they're not necessary after that. So the question I had then is our brain actually necessary? And secondly, we're going back to the Chinese medicine thing. Pretty early on, we learn about the different, Chinese medicine is quantum medicine, as I mentioned earlier, but one of the things that just blew my socks off was when I asked my teachers, I said, we've been through all the different organs, but I think you forgot one. And they say, what's that? And then I said, the brain. And they said, well, actually, the brain isn't considered an organ. It's an extraordinary fuel, and it's actually a sea of potential, like the bone marrow, or like our gonads, right? Or the uterus. These are seas of potentiality. They're not organs. They're not making things. Brains just. So what it's doing, in a sense, is like that sea squirt. We have developed our little primitive notochord to the point where it can so incredibly, in a so incredibly sophisticated way, figure out, given the zillion variables, where we should be placing our energies and perspectives, right? So I'm always amazed. You hear I've seen many patients who had hydrocephalus or whatever, and children, and they function really pretty well. I mean, what's our previous secretary of HUD became famous because he cut out half of a child's brain, right? And the child did fine. It's just like, oh, wow, so here am I, a neuropsychiatrist. And as you said, Chuck, I mean, clearly if there's something wrong with the brain substance, its ability to filter things, it's going to have consequences. But actually, if you live in a benign, supportive world, most of what I did as a neuropsychiatrist was work with families to make sure that their family member had a structured, predictable, safe, low emotional expression environment. They were auxiliary brains. And so, of course, now and there, boy, this is a whole other conversation, right? But you talked about that conversation you had around the internet. Well, now we're actually developing an external brain. Yep. And so, do we actually need Elon Musk? He can just drop a electrode into our brainstem and hook us into AI. And so anyway, there's some thoughts on what is a brain? Do we need a brain? What is a brain?
Yeah, and I want to go back something that you said. Thank you, Jim, because you said, in a way, if I heard you right, that we wouldn't need it if we live in a benign environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Most of us don't, right? And so and because we don't, we get into the need of the brain and the fight or flight response, and that, but so we're getting back to, okay, yes, we're talking about the brain and the mind, but what about the environment, the supportive environment? I mean, again, getting back a little bit to Chuck's study with the mother and children, right? When you shift the environment or the relationship, the people that are part of your environment, you can actually change the situation.
Right.
And so I think, when we think, for example, I think in the Tibetan and many other traditions, when they talk about mind, they bring their hand here, not here, right? But this is maybe that mind, sometimes we call it the heart mind. Maybe it's the mind in the benign environment. So I wanted to hear your.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, I learned that we're very fortunate to be born in the human realm, right? Because we are faced with an environment which elicits distress, dysregulation, i.e. interpretation of suffering, and therefore we should be motivated to feel better. And boy, we could go on forever and ever, right? But I mean, it's like, so what's so incredibly exciting to me is that, as I mentioned earlier, there was my mentor studying the cellular architecture of the insula. And now we know about these structures that are meta-relational, that when we did the wisdom course, Alejandro, I talked about, the 4 levels in the body, the brain in the world, the brain with the world, the brain above the world, and the brain way beyond the world. These structures, the insula, anterior cingulate, the cerebellum, right, mesofrontal, these are all ways that we have an opportunity, if we're actually asking the right questions and we're really motivated. Boy, now I have a scientific explanation that I need to build my meta-relational structures in my brain so I have more choices, so I'm not trapped in this hostile world, right? And of course, Chuck knows more than I do about the brain in the body, but this distinction between the body brain and the mind brain and the microbiome brain, and so it's just such an incredible time. But we need to be clear about these definitions. We can't mix metaphors here because it just gets us in such a mess. And it's not that complicated. I love the Vedantic concept of, these structures. So they talk about manas, which is your faculties. They talk about jhana, which is your perspectives, and then they talk about chitta, which is your mind, right? And I think it equates kind of nicely to how we might study the brain. So yeah, chitta. I mean, ultimately, if we don't, I hate to think that, the universal consciousness, whatever we want to call it, is actually hostile. That's not, I mean, I have to hope there's a home there that I can go to that I will actually feel safe. Otherwise, I might as well just, I guess, go for demigods. All the gods would be the good thing, right? I don't know.
Yeah, until you fell, right? I mean, I've read some bad reports of what happens when you burn through your good karma, though, man. It's,
yeah.
God, stay away from you. They hand you the water on a long pole, right? Because, you're starting to rot and you're heading down into Buddhist hell. Yeah, it's,
so before you go, I just wanted to add something, Chuck, to something that Jim said, and this is more for the audience, that Jim mentioned about the wisdom course. And this is, we did a course through Ligmincha and Wisdom Publications that had to do with the Serenity Rich Dialogues from last year. And it's called Buddhism and Science, and it's available in Wisdom Experience. So you can go into that. So I just wanted the audience to know that reference. Yes, Chuck, please.
No, I was just going to say that when you folks were talking, I started thinking about Shantideva, right? I mean, the whole first part of the Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life is, find that really cool place with the fruit and the waterfall, and that there's this clear recognition that environment, is a core aspect of ways to sort of optimize one's ability to seek enlightenment. So I mean, it's interesting that in that tradition that is kind of also recognized. I think this is along your idea of an encyclopedia, Jim, but you talk about suffering. One of the things that I have become obsessed with, and it directly comes out of the psychedelic sort of business, is when do you just try to interrupt suffering? When do you let suffering go on so that the benefits of suffering can be accrued to a person, right? So, I mean, you're right. This Buddhist idea that, humans are sort of the perfect gig if you want to try to become enlightened, because, you're not so constrained and tortured as the lower realms. You're not so off the hook as the higher realms, that it's this sort of sweet spot of misery. It's right. I mean, that's, but if we take that, because I've gotten really interested in this dialectic between standard antidepressants, and the way that this sort of reductionistic scientific worldview has taken us. Depression is kind of what I'm interested in. We have agents that when they work, what they tend to do is just make the suffering sort of go away, right? You're struggling with all these problems, feel like crap, you're beating up on yourself, and you take an SSRI like Prozac or something, and when it works, what people say is, I don't know, just stuff doesn't seem to, I don't know, no big deal, right? And at the cost often of life losing some of its savor, though.
Well, you induce an emotional apathy.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Even an existential apathy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. But so it's a little bit like earlier we were invoking the opiates, right? There's sort of like it's the same idea. You're in pain. Here's something that's going to make the pain go away. And the challenge with that, of course, in addition to the apathy and all that, is that then people end up, if they want that particular way for the pain to go away, usually many of us end up having to take antidepressants forever. Right. And then you start getting these whole other, there's always a downside, right? You're always, every time you tweak a system, even when you're in enlightenment trying to make things better, there's a shadow side to it, right? Whereas the psychedelics, one of the things that's fascinating about that approach is, you take people that are depressed in these studies we're doing, and you give them a high dose of something like psilocybin. And many people have a miserable experience. They're weeping, they're crying, they're sort of facing their demons, right? And it is suffering, right? But then afterwards, it's very common for people. It's sort of like, thank you, sir. I kind of needed that, right? It's like people come out of it and they have this feeling of, it's like after you've really felt grief and cried for a while, there's a feeling of ease and relief, right? There's some sort of acceptance, some sort of, and then just pride sometimes that you've withstood, your internal tormentors, but it's a radically different way of potentially treating depression that essentially is more, it not to be a cliche, but kind of going through your suffering, right? So I have gotten so interested in where we've kind of drifted off the mind-brain business, but I've gotten so interested in this idea of suffering and how we think about suffering. And obviously, there's got to be a place for both approaches and how we think about when you do one and when you do the other. But it's an interesting question. And
so this is, I think, to kind of pull a couple of threads there together. So there's suffering of change, the suffering of suffering, and there's all pervasive suffering, right? So, so there is a taxonomy there, and I think we would do well in Western medicine to be aware of that. I think to go back to what you started this thread on, for me, your question was, well, in essence, shouldn't we just let people suffer because they'll burn off bad karma? That's one point. But I think ultimately people seek relief from suffering, and for me the role of a healer is to be a journeyman along the evolutionary impulse towards wholeness, right? So I'm a journeyman, that as a healer, at least that's my perspective. And so I'm going to show up in people's journeys. This is a very shamanic kind of perspective, right? But I think it has modern validity. I'm going to show up in your journey. Now, I might show up in your journey when you are in the middle of a divorce, right? I might show up in your journey when you've just broken your leg. They're all suffering. They're different kinds. We could put them into that taxonomy. But for me, that you really start suffering when that, as I mentioned earlier, when you have that experience of being disconnected, when you're stuck. So in Chinese medicine, we use our needles to remove blockages within the physical ecosystem that are impeding the free flow of qi, which is the manifestation of energy in this tight space-time continuum. We use the needles to remove blockages to allow the organism to continue its journey, which it follows innately and instinctively towards the sunshine, the Shen. So what I have to be careful about then is whose agenda is this? So what concerns me around treatment selection is if all I have is a hammer, then everything's a nail, right? So unfortunately, psychiatrists, all they've had is, they're antipsychotropics, and anybody who walks in the room, that's what they get, regardless of whether they're going through a divorce.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what concerns me is that we are escalating the power of our treatment. I mean, the hallucinogens are profoundly powerful. I've had experience with this, down in Ecuador and other places. I mean, these are powerful treatments, but they come out of an ecosystem of consciousness. And when Danielle, the shaman I work with, was working with someone, he would go for a walk, and the jungle would tell him which of the plants he should pick. It wasn't, hey, Dr. Jim has just got approval to give ketamine spray, and by the way, he makes $7,000 for every course. And so I've certainly had patients almost as a first line of treatment. Here's your ketamine. I think that's very dangerous. I think what I mentioned earlier, the opiate crisis, is when you drop essentially what is in the going back to the 60s, right? And hate, the addicts, heroin addicts, their name for opiates was mother. I need some mother, right? And when you drop opiates into a consciousness that's so disconnected and so lacking of nurturance and community support, what you get is an epidemic. It fills the vacuum. So I mean, hallucinogens are amazing opportunities for the right person applied with the right intention. And if used correctly, as you mentioned, they can open up a space that can facilitate this movement of spirit towards wholeness. And that's wonderful. I just hope that our culture has the wisdom to understand how to use these things. And as you know, there's companies trying to patent these.
Oh, yeah.
So
40 new companies, Jim. 40. When I started this, there were 2 nonprofits. Now there's 44 profits. 2 of them are valued at more than $1 billion. No, we're going to do it the Western way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to happen if these things can pass muster with the FDA. My hope is that after we've done that, we will come. You know how it often is, right? All this happens and it kind of blows up, and then the truer way of doing things will sometimes settle in. And I that's my hope about psychedelics, because I agree with you. My bias is that these are not going to do well in the giant pharma. The paradigm we're talking about of this reduction. We'll see. Never say never, but I personally think that.
Let me bring something that you both mentioned before, if I may, here, Chuck.
Sure.
And that is, Jim mentioned it from the Chinese system and how with acupuncture, and so, in a way, you unblock areas where there's qi, what I like to call qi traffic jam, right? And so, and you mentioned Tumo, Chuck, and in a way, and subtle body, that even though we can't really verify it, it is utilized in the systems and the system of the chakras that are also through breath and through practice, like in Tumo, retention and so forth, opening these particular energetic areas to open up the flow of the chi of, prana, lung, you call it in whichever language, but really opens up, right? And opens up this experience that may release suffering. And as it interconnects, as we were saying, with the environment, what really also comes up is the experience of compassion. So I like to move from what moves us from suffering to compassion. And I know you both have done work in this field. So, and where does that come from? Does compassion come from, a lot of people think, well, compassion is part of the heart, but how is it part of the brain as well? Or is it not? So if we can shift kind of from the suffering side now to the compassion, if you guess from the diagnosis to the treatment, and we can go a little bit in that direction.
So first of all, I just want to, once again, we have to be clear about language: compassion, altruism, empathy, cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, spontaneous empathy. These are different forms. And so we mix up empathy with altruism, with compassion. They're very different, right? So compassion describes an intention. Altruism is compassion with legs. Empathy is the capacity to pick up the experiential state of others. I think for me, and I'm interested in Chuck's response to this, the issue of mirror neurons. I said earlier that science is shaped by the questions that we ask, the intention of the scientists, and also what they choose to do, what society chooses to do with the finding, right? So, what 10 years or more now, I guess, mirror neurons were finally, the world was told that we have these neurons in our brain that actually are mirrors, are reflecting the world around us, that everything that happens around us is happening and is reflected within our brains, not within our minds, but our brains, right? Now, if you extrapolate that, we can not only we're not only mirroring people's emotions, we're mirroring their intentions, their bodily movements. My dog moves, I move, and my brain is experiencing movement. So, boy, what an incredible finding. This was described as possibly the most important finding in neuroscience in the last 100 years. And here we are 10 years later. This is brain-based stuff. I mean, these are physical substance neurons, right? Very specific. Why this to me is incredibly important. If we actually said, wow, when other people feel better, my brain feels better. When other people are happy, I'm happy. When other people are suffering, I suffer. If we actually took that science at face value, we would change our society. And yet we have chosen to ignore it. I just don't see it. It came up for a little while and now it's disappeared. So my question then is, how can we ignore a finding like that? Because brain, mind, this is real science. How can we ignore this? Because if the findings should tell us that we need to change our entire society. So I'm interested in your comments.
No, there must be some, I mean, obviously there must be some, countervailing force, right? That doesn't allow us to, I mean, I guess it's this sort of, there seems to be this sort of yin and yang between that perspective and the perspective of, I just want to get what's right for me. If I win, if I succeed, if I beat you, if I have more goods, more money, more power, whatever, that's the fast one, right? We can all see immediately that's the payoff for human beings. It's a subtler sort of thing to recognize that the maniacal, self-focused way of getting at that. Two things, right? Usually it doesn't work, right? So, I mean, most people that act like that end up not doing well in life. The ones that do remain sort of psychologically miserable because, you can be very rich and very powerful and very miserable. Jim, you and I have seen plenty of rich, powerful people. We know about that, right? It's a subtler idea that at core, so I'm just talking like evolutionary stuff. It's a subtler idea at core that humans primarily succeed as a species through cooperation and through sort of a group collective ability to mirror each other, to do exactly what you said. That on average, that is the way towards a sort of a human payoff. Payoff is a sense at the end of one's life that one is satisfied with what one's done, one feels good about what one's done, right? So it's hard, right? I mean, that requires I think that requires probably a more mature understanding of the world and a mature way of doing things, because you have to play a long game if you want to get the payoff of, your happiness being connected with other people's happiness. I mean, one of my favorite Dalai Lama quotes was, nothing wrong with being selfish, just be smart about your selfishness, right? Mm-hmm. Really want to be selfish, work for the good of others, because that's how you're going to enhance your own well-being. I mean, that's the essence of what we're talking about. I believe that, so powerfully. I mean, are there times when it doesn't work? Yeah. I mean, there's times when you do that and you get screwed, but in the grand scheme of things, that I believe just pragmatically, because of the creatures we evolved to be, is exactly right. And I agree with you. I mean, this whole idea of the mirror neurons, there had to be something like that, right? Christ, we're so responsive to each other, and dogs got to have a few motor neurons, mirror neurons, because, you see dogs with each other, you see them with us, you talk about your dog, Jim, but I mean, it must be that the world gets reenacted inside ourselves. How else would we be able to, to really understand what the world is?
And reenacting not just with other neurons, but with the whole universe, and
Yes.
Shiva's dance, right? And so
Yeah.
I had a question, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure where we are with time, but I think this would be really interesting kind of capstone. So positive psychology, of course, is a shift, and we're trying to move away against the anti-psychology, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, to developing positive skills. So everything really is a consequence of our alignment around scarcity and therefore fear, right? So if we can move into this abundance model, but you're doing amazing work at the University of Wisconsin that I would love to hear some more about in this context about how do we, I think about Viktor Frankl. I remember seeing Viktor Frankl, father of logotherapy, meaning-based therapy. And he says, he's talking to a bunch of kids, and he said, your life, you're kind of just taken off from the runway right now. And he says, if you just elevate a few degrees, 20 years from now, you're going to be in a whole different stratosphere than you are. So for me, the issue is how can we do a better job of supporting the evolution of our children, an orientation around their capacity for positive emotion engagement. And you're doing that kind of work at the University of Wisconsin, which it's both brain work and it's also mind in the larger sense, right?
Yeah. And absolutely, it's small differences. I remember this famous statistics guy at UCLA when I first was trying to study TUMO. And Jim Minsk asked me, what's the percentage difference between the best and the worst batter in baseball? And I said, Christ, I don't watch baseball. He said, well, it's only really point something or other percent. The reason it matters is that the best hitter on average is always that much better. And small differences, it's like compound interest over time make these huge effects. So exactly what you're talking about the runway, right? 2 degrees doesn't look like much over 100 yards, over 100 miles, right? You're in outer space. And I think that is another one of these profound life truths, man, that is, that like the mirror neurons, that we would do so much better in life if we were able to really kind of enact that. I am also, I have kids, 12-year-olds, and they're kind of the center of my life. So I think a great deal about what you're talking about, like how do we help them, how do we help them begin to move towards this sort of human fullness, one of the things I think we do is we try to do it ourselves too. I think part of it is that, kids have to feel like you're there for them, and that frankly, probably that you'd lay your life down for them. I mean, that is sort of the sort of core human thing. But I think the other thing is, I think if they see, it's what you said, Jim, you're exactly right. When other people are happy, you're happy. When you see inspirational success, your little mirror neurons go off and you say, and if you see your parents, heading in that same direction themselves, I think that is probably the most inspiring thing that a kid can see, because then they believe that capacity is in them. And, and the opposite, and you and I have seen it many times, God forbid when a parent commits suicide, this sort of complete failure, the kids collapse and their rate of suicide skyrockets. It's the depth of our interconnection. This goes back to the beginning of this conversation, the depth of our interconnection, the fact that the factors that influence our conscious experience are dispersed and intertwined with each other in ways that are so much. We're just completely blind to how interconnected we are, right? That man, when you see that, this is it. I mean, one of the reasons that we need to progress in our own lives is to help other people progress in theirs. It's just an important thing.
I remember watching a mind and life dialogue between His Holiness and a cognitive neuroscientist, and they were describing to him the default mode network, which to me is the bugaboo of the modern mind. I mean, I'm like a spelunker who spends his time trying to help people get rid of all of their stalactites of dysfunctional negative thinking in their default mode. But His Holiness, at the end of the presentation, he turned to them and said, and I'm going to paraphrase, he said, how could you possibly allow your mind to become this way? I would like to reframe that. I would say, how could you possibly allow your brains to develop that way?
Yeah.
So to me, that's the thing. It's not that It's not like that's our mind. Our mind is pure. Chitta is pure. But we have these brains that we have trained through habits of culture, of whatever families, that are really messy, and they create all these obscurations of what reality is.
Yeah.
And, we now have a science. It's so amazing. We now have a science of the brain that says, you know what, you can sort it out. You actually have a vacuum cleaner, and you have a way of putting a few more stories. You have more space in your head,
Yeah.
And
as His Holiness says, in a way, it's an education of mind and heart, right? He has many times and given talks on this, and I think this also addresses this area of, when we talk about mind, even though we always focus on brain, it's mind includes maybe heart, maybe other areas as well, but certainly those two areas as areas of not a heart as just a heart organ or just where the passion is and the emotions are, but really that sense of home, right? And that sense of cultivation through that.
So in Chinese medicine, just a quick thing, Chinese medicine, this heart is the residence of Shen. Shen is the emperor. Now, the emperor's role within the culture is to provide the larger vision of what's possible for the community, and to respond to things when they're out of balance, and to maybe call in some of the ministers of the environment or sewerage, whatever, and say, listen, things are out of balance. Let's get back. Let me remind you of our vision. So,
and is Shen also the spirit part?
Sorry?
Is Shen also spirit in that sense?
Well, it's Shen. We call it mind, which is equivalent to Chitta. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's really that's that's a whole conversation, right? But I just love this idea of heart it's our emperor, it's our vision that we can be happy, that happiness is our birthright, and that if we can figure out with how our brain works. And say, hey, listen, my default mode network's getting too much activation here, and it's full of junk, and I want to replace. I like to say replacing ants' automatic negative thoughts with pets, positively engaged thoughts, right? So I'm going to change my software program and my default mode network. It's very practical. That's our brain, right? I'm going to build a connectivity with my insular cortex or my self-referential mesofrontal cortex. It's very concrete, right? That's our brain. I love His Holiness's comment because it tells us, okay, we can actually work with our brains. Our minds
and of course, you'd say, Jim, that lets in more mind.
It really opens us to a broader experience of our capacity, right?
Yep.
Yeah. To be happy. Yeah. That's how I would see it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful, and I really enjoyed being with both of you, and I hope the audience has too. And I like this reminding that the heart is the emperor. So don't let the brain take over. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Milos, for hosting. I wanted to remind the audience, next month it's going to be on body, both in terms of the 24-hour practice as Rinpoche's teachings, and also our conversation would be with Laura Schmassel, who is in the yoga world and teacher and researcher, and Marieke van Vogt, who's in Netherlands, and she's a dancer, and she brings that area of body into contemplative research as well. So that's on August 10th, same time. Again, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Chuck. And everyone, have a great day and great month. And we'll see you next month. Be well. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Cyber Sangha podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Cyber Sangha, visit us online at cybersangha.net.